Tim Barton is the president of Wall Builders. He's also the author of a new book, The American Story, Building the Republic. And he joins me now here on the Will Cain Show. Hey, Tim.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on. Good to be with you.
I'm glad to have you on. This new book you have out with your dad focuses in on 7 presidents, the first, really, 7 presidents of the United States, and how they helped build the republic. I want to talk about various aspects of each of these men and the cultural landscape where they built this American experiment. But what was it about these 7 that you found incredibly unique when you survey American presidents?
Specifically, all 7 of these were involved in the American Revolution. Andrew Jackson being the 7th president, he was the youngest. He was a teenager at the time. It was actually, he was too young to legally be a soldier, but he found his way in as a young teenager. He was a spy for a little while. He was actually captured, was a prisoner of war. There was a British officer who wanted to really kind of demean Andrew Jackson as a young teenager and told him to get down and polish his boots. Andrew Jackson wasn't going to do it. So the officer raised his sword and strikes down at Andrew Jackson. He put up his hand and he had a scar on his hand and his face that he carried with him the rest of his life from that moment. Well, all that to say is all of them actively partook in America becoming a nation. So once you get past Andrew Jackson, none of the other presidents were actively part of America becoming a nation in the American Revolution. So all of these individuals were unique because they all knew the founding fathers. They largely knew each other. They had worked together or against each other in some situations. So these are the ones who had the best understanding. When we talk about the Constitution and maybe how to apply it, how it would work, and maybe how not to do things, they're the ones that had the best perspective. And so we just kind of walk through and journey through their lives in this book.
What did they have in common in terms of their vision for America? Because these men, I just went through my 7 worst presidents in American history. And I will tell you in the audience, there is a fundamental philosophical background to who I think were the worst presidents in America. And it's really beyond left and right. It's beyond Republican and Democrat. It actually comes down to rights, this vision of rights. Basically, it comes down to negative rights versus positive rights. There are many presidents who've believed in the idea of positive rights, a positive health care, a job, leisure. And those presidents, Wilson and FDR and LBJ, set about the government in providing that to the people. Of course, it has to come from somewhere. You have to take it from other people. Whereas other presidents, and I would argue our Constitution, focus on negative rights, your freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. These are rights granted by God. This is the implication is natural law. There are some things men have a right to that can't be provided by others, but can only be provided by God. What was it about those 7? Because they all had different visions of America. Jefferson, Adams hated each other, right? So what was the common vision for America?
Well, probably the thing that all 7 of them had in common is they loved America. They didn't see America as fundamentally flawed or evil. And I say that because in the current context, right, that's a huge ideology, a huge philosophy in American politics today. And the early presidents had a love for the nation. Now, even mentioning someone like a John Adams or a Thomas Jefferson, they actually had been pretty close. And under George Washington, they had been friends. And it was during George Washington they had their falling out. And then, of course, their presidential campaigns against each other and lots of issues that came from that. But their falling out was something that if you go back to George Washington and his farewell address, it's so profound, the things that he saw coming. It was like he's the dad in the room, and his cabinet were all his kids. Now, this is not how it was, but this is kind of the perspective. And he saw his kids start to argue. In his farewell address, he was giving them guidance of like, now, kids, keep in mind, don't be distracted by foreign entanglements. Focus on America. Why? Because one of the biggest divisions that was happening during his administration is France and England were going through another one of their bloody fights and their bloody wars. And America never could have won the revolution had it not been for France being an ally. But we were largely English individuals. And so we had incredible connections in England. And so his administration was divided. Some of them were just loyal, loved France, and some of them were loyal to England because the revolution was decades earlier at that point, and we've largely kind of come back together and we're friends again. And Washington wisely said, guys, don't allow other people's problems to become American problems and divide us. And I think it's interesting now, considering things like Ukraine and Russia and other issues in the world. And we could argue, I get it, like there's a reason America should be concerned and pay attention to those things. But Washington very wisely pointed out, don't focus all your time and attention there. He goes on in his farewell address and he explains to not let political partisanship be what drives you. Focus on priority philosophy over your party, right? That the idea behind who we are as Americans, don't become divided in party. Well, of course, then you have Adams and Jefferson that all they care about is their party and their side winning. But it's interesting, if you walk through Washington's farewell address, it was the advice he was giving, again, kind of like to his kids. Really, they were his friends, they were his allies, but he's giving advice for success for the nation. And as we walk through our book, The American Story, Building the Republic, we tell the story, the background of all their lives. So you kind of see them as a kid growing up, each of them independent, and you learn a lot of the story of America through their eyes. But then you see a lot of what would define their success and failure as a president really would be how well did they follow the advice George Washington gave them. And we would point out, not least being among those, Washington said that the political pillars or the pillars rather of our political prosperity were the pillars of religion and morality. He said, if we ever lose religion and morality, that America would not work and function. When John Adams became president the following year, he actually wrote a letter and said that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. And one of the things we do in the book is walk through when they understood the moral foundation, when the founding fathers years earlier had said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, but they go through this idea of truth. But where do they get the idea of truth? There was a common foundation they also all had that was a foundation largely learned through religion and morality, but going back to the Bible, that even though we might argue not all of these men were Christians, because they weren't, they maybe didn't all believe in Jesus, they all had learned the same similar moral values from the Bible. And so just several of those thoughts and ideas, if we look at what brought them together, they had a similar upbringing in a moral structural sense. They had a similar love for America, and they had the similar guidance given to them by George Washington. And their success and failures largely centered around how well do they follow his advice and how well do they follow the guidelines, the outlines of the Declaration and the Constitution.
You know, something we talk a lot about today is the people versus the elites. It seems to be a dividing line within American society. I'm curious, these men, were they from what you talked about, that you write about their background and how they were raised?
Yeah.
They were all, well, I think, at least the founding father generation of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison were obviously well educated. Were these men the elite of their time? Were they wealthy? Were they studied as compared to the common man in America?
So there's a lot in those questions, because even the idea of well-educated, George Washington said that his two greatest embarrassments in his life were hhis lack of education and his bad teeth. By the time he was president, he only had one actual real tooth. All the rest were fake teeth. He eventually lost that tooth as president, so he finished his presidency with no real teeth. He was wearing dentures, lots of things surrounding that. But Washington never had the formal, proper education that someone like a Jefferson or John Adams did. And if you read his farewell address, you would never know that, partly because what they did in early education, even if you only went for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years, or kind of they did grades, or not grades, actually levels. They did levels. We know them as grades. But if you went through 3 or 4 or 5 levels, what they accomplished was so much more than what we generally accomplish in 3 or 4 or 5 grades. So they all had different educational backgrounds. Most of them ended up becoming wealthy, but it wasn't wealthy in the way that a Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell might have become wealthy, that they were able to do some insider trading deals in Congress and enrich themselves. That was not what they did. George Washington inherited a lot of things from his brother, from his father. He made a lot of wise business decisions. John Adams was an attorney, was a very successful attorney. Jefferson was also someone who inherited a lot, although he had a lot of debt. And so when you go through their lives, they were not a political ruling elite. The reason they were chosen initially early on, going back maybe even for many of them to like the Continental Congress, the reason leaders were chosen is because of their character, because of their ability to stand and maybe clearly articulate, maybe clearly write something, but having the courage and boldness to stand up If you go back, for example, kind of more founding era, a guy like Sam Adams is a really fun guy to think about. Most people today know the name Sam Adams because there's a beer named after Sam Adams. And that's really all they know. Sam Adams was one of the most outspoken patriots for the cause of liberty, but Sam Adams was one of the poorest people at the time when the word spread that different communities, hey, send leaders. This was the Continental Congress time, that very first time they met in 1774. Communities were told, send a leader to represent you to come and let's get all our leaders together from all 13 colonies. Let's talk through this. And Sam Adams was the obvious choice for that area of Massachusetts, but his town was embarrassed of him because he only had one suit. It had holes in it. He had one pair of stockings that had holes in it. So the town did a fundraiser to raise money for Sam Adams. They bought him a new suit. They bought him 7 pairs of stockings. The town was kind of poor as well. Sam Adams did not have a horse. They didn't have a horse to loan him. And so they wrote a letter to John Adams, his cousin, and said, would you be willing to loan your cousin a horse so he doesn't have to walk to Philadelphia? And I say this to give context because so often we have the founding fathers in this position that all of them were the same, and they weren't. You had farmers, you had doctors, you had military individuals, you had kind of across the board of lawyers, whatever kind of practices, teachers that we would see today. They were just normal people, but they were individuals who were very clear on their positions of the overreach of the king and the limitations of what government should have and our inalienable rights that were given to us by our creator. The founding fathers were such a unique, diverse collection. So even in the first 7 presidents, you had some that came from dire poverty, some that came from a pretty well-off position, some that were farmers, some that were attorneys, some that were military individuals. It's a pretty wide spectrum, but they are a very accurate representation of we the people and reflective of the opportunities that America offered to an individual who had high character, who would work hard, who had potential and ability and could develop that. This was what the American dream was all about.
You know, you brought up, and it's absolutely true, that the idea of a free society with constitutionally enshrined rights, even in the founders' vision, could only exist set against the backdrop of a moral society, of some other cultural enforcement mechanism of teaching people how they should and should not behave, not just how they can and cannot behave. And so the Judeo-Christian ethic sat there as the foundation for all of the freedoms that we have today, or that we enshrined then, that we would enjoy today. You can't go, again, a parallel to today, Tim, you can't go but a couple of paragraphs in any of the founding documents or those that served as the backdrop, like the Federalist Papers, without hearing the word factions. It's a source of concern for the first presidents. Factions, people with competing interests taking over or set against one another here in America. Man, it seems like a diagnosis for where we arrived at in 2023.
There's no doubt. The division in America today, the fact the founding fathers were able to unite, and there's a really fun letter from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson in 1813, where they're reflective at this point. They've both gone through their presidencies. They've been reunited. One of the other founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, helps them become friends again in their old age. And actually, their letters in old age are kind of funny. They're grumpy old men writing letters back and forth, complaining about things they don't like, this rising generation. But in 1813, John Adams writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson and says, remember when we were young men and we were all together, the thing that brought us together, he said, we were so diverse in our ideas, in our interests, but the thing that brought us together, they were the general principles of Christianity. And the letter's much longer, but that phrase is super interesting because when the founding fathers identified that we hold these truths to be self-evident, where did they come up with the idea of truth? And I say that only to give contrast in modern culture. We live in a culture where we're being told truth is subjective, that it's up to each individual. And maybe it could be collective, but everybody has to determine truth for themselves. And this is where it becomes really challenging because how do you unite a culture when you have maybe half the culture that believes, just as an example, right? I'm not trying to get super controversial right now, but as a contrast example, when you have half the culture, for example, that believes that boys and girls are real things, right? That X and Y chromosomes are real things. And then you have a huge portion, rising portion of culture that believes that no, gender, sexuality, like it's fluid. You can be what you want and however many genders you want to be. that's going to be really hard to find a common ground to unite when truth has become so subjective that if you think you're a cat, right, you think you're a furry, you can be a furry. And whether or not I think it's crazy or not is not the point, other than to say, how are you going to unite as a nation when truth has become so subjective that we're not going to have common ground to unite around? This is where the founding fathers, where it was so different for them, is they were able to find common ground in the midst of the craziness, in the midst of the diversity of views and opinions. They still found common ground. And this is where I think one of the major challenges we have to work on in our culture is finding that common ground again. I think for so many, right, parents are going, hey, I care about our kids. I think there is common ground, but this is where we're not hearing it from a news media. It's something I so appreciate about podcasts like this that are long form podcasts. We can have an honest conversation and not just have a soundbite where the media is trying to gin up hype and controversy to get their ratings and clicks and views, that are doing things that are fragmenting further the American population, instead of recognizing, look, for most of us, man, we love our families. We want freedom. We don't want the government to get all involved in our lives. We want a limited government. There is common ground for the majority of American people. That's what the founding fathers were able to unite around. In the midst of their factions, they found common ground. And I think, Will, that's one of the biggest challenges for us today, is trying to help find common ground that people can unite around.
Well, I think that example that you gave is a perfect illustration of factions, by the way, because that's not a 50-50 proposition. You're talking about a small minority, very vested, very passionate, who can wield factionally their power against the greater populace that might have a lot more common ground in the truth. And that's just only one illustration. That one issue, I think, is actually one illustration of so many where you have small, loud minority that is the activated faction. Last thing I'd love to ask you is this. So, it's kind of, I've always liked Jefferson because, one, I like his Federalist vision of, or rather, not Federalist vision, but his federalism vision of America. I like the idea of small sovereign, communities where you build your vision of America and then come together for national defense, as opposed to the Hamiltonian or Adams vision of a more strong centralized government. And I think Madison doesn't get near enough attention. I think Madison was a genius. But I keep going back, and it's like, why I won't root for the New York Yankees. It's like, okay, everybody talks about Washington. Let me think about Madison. Let me think about Jefferson. But sooner or later, you got to recognize that the Yankees are actually great, and Washington is phenomenal. And what you described earlier, he easily could have been king. And it's hard for any of us to live back in that moment or that time or be that man and know, wow, this guy turned it all down and actually set the stage. As much as the founding documents, the execution of the founding documents set the stage for what would become really the most successful revolution in human history. When you look at all of these guys, then, Tim, and you kind of started about this earlier, let's apply it to today. What did they have that we need today in a leader?
That is probably the most important question. And really, that's something we dive into in our book, is when we look back, it's easy, as you mentioned, to think of George Washington as, man, this incredible person. And I say that in the context knowing that there's people today in cancel culture that want to cancel him. And it's one of the reasons that as we go through our book, we have more than 1,000 footnotes in our book, because we want people to know that the things we're suggesting is not just a perspective that, right, in modern academics, a professor might say, hey, I have a PhD, that's my credentials, you need to believe what I say. And we would go the exact opposite direction. We would say, please, don't just take our word for it. Go back and read this document. Read what they actually wrote, because there's so many things we believe about these individuals that are not historically grounded, that are not historically accurate, but it's become the modern narrative. And like so many lies, if you repeat it long enough and loud enough, people believe it. And if you go back to their leadership ideas, Jefferson is such a great example. His position was that the federal government should only do for people what they cannot do for themselves. And even more specifically, in the Constitution, there are specific enumerated powers that are the federal government's power. Beyond that, you have in the Bill of Rights, you have the 9th and 10th Amendment. The 9th Amendment says that there are more rights that belong to the people than just what's identified earlier in the Bill of Rights. And the 10th Amendment says that anything not specifically given to the federal government in the U.S. Constitution belongs to the states. When Jefferson was president, that's the way he ran his presidency. There were certain things he said the federal government can't do that. And people were going, you have to do it. He said, nope, we can't do it. It's not in the Constitution. And the Constitution is what tells us exactly what we can and can't do. This is so different from the notion of we have a pen and a phone. These were people that were grounded in moral truth, that limited often themselves to the Constitution. And we do in our book, we go through and we try to tell the honest story where there's good, bad, and ugly in people's lives, right? Every one of us, we're not perfect people. We have good moments, and sometimes we have really bad moments. And for some people, their good moments are far more significant, far more outshining their bad moments. And some, it's the opposite. And I think if you look at someone, for example, like a Jackson, where Jackson, this amazing leader, up until really he becomes president, and then he begins to do things that begin to trample on the rights of individuals. And he begins to do things that are so partisan. He made the post office a cabinet level position. He took somebody that was one of his political advisors, puts him in charge of the post office, and he tells them that they don't have to deliver any mail that is sent by abolitionists. He gives the post office full authority to start censoring the mail. And there's very famous pictures and stories from that time of different people that worked for the post office that were throwing or ripping or burning mail from abolitionists that were promoting the idea of how evil slavery was. Jackson was a guy who went a very different direction. And so in our book, we try to go back and point out when our nation was the strongest is when there were people who were our leaders who had a moral compass outlined for them from the ideas of the Bible, because frankly, I would argue there's no greater moral teacher than Jesus, no better morals outlined than those in the Bible, and those who limited themselves by the Constitution and knew the federal government's job is limited according to the Constitution. The federal government's only supposed to do very specific things enumerated in the Constitution, and the government really, the idea from the founding fathers in the Declaration, they said that to secure these rights, to secure our God-given rights, government instituted among men. Government exists to protect American citizens, to protect their rights, to protect our ability to function, to thrive, to have a job, to raise families, to do business. The government shouldn't be micromanaging, interfering in our lives, taking all of our money. They've lost that idea. So we would encourage the kind of leaders we need are those that have a moral foundation rooted probably in the Bible and Scripture, and those that understand the Constitution. If we could restore those two things, America would be a far better place.
The American story. Building the Republic. Wonderful answer there on the type of leader that we should search for based upon those that we had to create this great experiment of the United States of America. Tim Barton, thanks so much for being with us here on The Will Cain Show.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.